Mother hated having a daughter so much that she wanted to kick me out of her happy family after getting a stepson. Like she tampered with my food and smirked as I ate it. My mother has never been a girl's girl, if you know what I mean. My mother never hid her disappointment about giving birth to me. She would openly admit to everyone, even in my presence, that she had always wanted a baby boy. The fact that she ended up with a daughter seemed to her like some kind of unfortunate twist of fate. She would tell her friends how she was stuck now with me forever, which was incredibly painful to hear. It felt like a rejection of my very existence, and invalid of who I was simply because of my gender. From a young age I would also notice a stark difference in how my mother treated me compared to all my cousins. While they were often showered with praise and affection from her, whenever we met with them I always received a colder, more critical attitude from her. She also would scold me if I acted too girlish. According to her, I was banned from buying anything pink for myself since she felt it was too girly, and I needed to stop acting like other girls. I was also banned from wearing skirts or dresses. She dressed me like a boy for a very long time and would only allow me to play with toy cars and trucks. I was also not allowed to keep long hair, as she felt it was too much to take care of, and always made me cut my hair very short. Honestly, I just never understood her obsession with gender. Why did it matter so much whether I was a girl or a boy? Why couldn't she see beyond that and appreciate me for who I was as a child? These thoughts swirled in my head, creating a storm of confusion and hurt. Her behavior planted seeds of self-doubt and insecurity in me. I began to question my worth and whether I could ever live up to her expectations. It was a heavy burden for a child to bear, knowing that in her eyes I was a constant reminder of her unfulfilled desire for a son. I couldn't grasp why my mother, the person who was supposed to love and support me unconditionally, was so fixated on something I had no control over. As if this wasn't enough, she also had a particular disdain for other women in our lives, frequently indulging in harsh criticisms and gossip about them. If a female coworker of my mother ever got promoted, she would complain to my dad and me, insinuating that the woman must have slept her way to get the promotion. It was her default assumption, her go-to explanation for any woman's success in the workplace. The idea that a woman could achieve something through hard work and merit seemed foreign to her. It was as if in her eyes women could only advance by compromising their integrity. If a classmate of mine received more appreciation from a teacher, my mother would quickly jump to the conclusion that the child's mother must be having an affair with the teacher, hence the said child was getting extra brownie points. Not only was all of this weird for me to hear her as a child, but this negative attitude of hers was a constant presence in my life, shaping much of my childhood and how I perceived myself and others. As you can imagine, my mother's comments made it hard for me to form healthy relationships with other women. Her constant bashing of other women created an atmosphere where I felt it was almost wrong to admire or be close to any females in my life. The idea that women were always competing against each other, always out to undermine or deceive, was in the back of my mind constantly. If I ever befriended any women, my mother would constantly remind me about how it was better to befriend men and how men were always more helpful. This is why for a very long time I only had male friends at school, since I was afraid of befriending a female and getting backstabbed by her. As if all these things were not enough, when I was in high school my dad confessed to my mother that he wanted a divorce. This was quite unexpected, as I always thought my parents had the perfect marriage. However, it turned out that he had been having an affair with one of his co-workers. The revelation was a bombshell, shaking the very foundations of our family. My mother, devastated and furious, packed her bags and took me with her to live in a motel. What followed next was a nasty divorce battle between the both of them. My mother's anger towards my father was intense and consuming. She would constantly use me as a pawn in her battle against him. I became a tool for her to him to inflict pain and assert her dominance. Whenever I expressed a desire to spend time with my dad during their separation, she would get furious at me. She would scream and yell, accusing me of choosing him over her, the man who had betrayed us. Her accusations were relentless. He cheated on us, she would scream, her voice filled with hurt and betrayal. You shouldn't even be in contact with him. The idea that I might want or need a relationship with my father was incomprehensible to her. In her eyes, maintaining any connection with him was A direct betrayal of her and all she had suffered whenever I attempted to tell her that I needed both of my parents and that I couldn't just cut my father out of my life. Her response was filled with venom. She would accuse me of trying to backstab her, of being disloyal. You should be ashamed of yourself. You're just like every other woman, she would say, her words dripping with contempt. It was a cruel and cutting remark, one that echoed her deep-seated issues with women. And trust, I did try my best to understand her perspective, but I also missed my dad a lot. He was always a good father to me regardless of his equation with my mother. Whenever ever my dad and I met, unlike my mother, he never uttered a word against her. When he discovered that my mother had told me about his affair, he immediately apologized and took full responsibility for his actions. He explained that he had been deeply unhappy in his marriage and that falling in love with his coworker had been unexpected. Despite this, he emphasized multiple times that cheating on my mother was a grave mistake. He assured me that when I grew up he would be open to answering any questions I might have about what happened. Navigating my parents' divorce as a single child was one of the hardest challenges of my life. It forced me to grow up quickly, but it also taught me that my parents are just like any other human being and they tend to make mistakes. My dad has remained a constant presence in my life ever since the divorce, ensuring he fulfills his responsibilities. He has consistently paid child support to my mother, demonstrating his commitment to providing for me despite his separation from my mother. He also allowed my mother and me to continue living in our family home even though he moved out. The condition was that I would live with my mother in this house so as to ensure stability in my life. He did not want me and my mother to have to go through the process of moving all our things and moving to a completely new neighborhood. Primarily I reside with my mother, but I get to spend every other weekend with my dad. This arrangement allows me to maintain a relationship with both parents. I have to admit that ever since the divorce my mother has become worse towards me. As a parent, I mean, I love her, but she is very fixated on getting married before my dad does. I believe her ego was deeply bruised by the fact that my dad cheated on her. After their separation was finalized, she began going out more frequently to bars and clubs, eager to meet new people and perhaps find a new partner quickly. This led to her meeting Dave just 3 months after the divorce. Dave is a DJ and a single father to his son Matthew. Dave and his ex-wife had Matthew when they were quite young, and after she left them, Dave took on the full responsibility of raising their son. Matthew is 3 years younger than me and seems pretty polite. Dave too comes across as a nice guy. However, the real issue began when I started noticing my mother's behavior around Matthew. As you know, my mother had always wanted a son, a dream that never came true for her. So when Dave and Matthew entered our lives, it seemed she was quite excited at the prospect of potentially having Matthew as a son. She constantly went shopping with him, buying him new shoes or shirts, and she would proudly tell all her friends about how great Matthew was at school or how proud she was of him. At first I thought maybe I was just being jealous and overreacting, but it became even more clear that something was amiss when even my dad started noticing the same thing as well. My mother would constantly call my dad to ask if I could spend more days with him because she wanted to go on road trips with her boyfriend and his son instead of staying with me at home. If Dave had a performance anywhere, my mother would tag along with him. I tried not to care so much about her changing behavior as I was always happy to spend more time with my dad. One day things came to a head when my mother came back home from one of her road trips and informed me that she and Dave got engaged. This was unexpected and too soon, since they had only been dating for a few months. I wanted to question her, but I knew if I said anything negative she would take it as me not supporting her. So I just kept my mouth shut and told her instead how happy I was for her. My mother then informed me that she had decided Dave and Matthew would be moving in with us. I was taken aback by this announcement, especially since the house wasn't even hers to begin with. It belonged to my dad, who had allowed us to continue living there after the divorce. As expected, when Dad heard about her plans, he was furious. He told her in no uncertain terms that if she wanted Dave and Matthew to move in, then Dave would have to pay him rent every month. He wasn't going to let another person stay in his house for free. My mother didn't take this well. She argued with Dad, accusing him of being jealous and trying to sabotage her relationship because she Was finally happy with someone she was. Convinced that his refusal to let Dave move in without paying rent was a deliberate attempt to ruin things for her, but Dad was firm. He reminded her that the house belonged to him and that he had only allowed her to stay there because of me. He made it clear that if she thought he was being such a pain in the ass, then she would also have to start paying rent or move out. The whole situation escalated, but in the end Dave stepped in and agreed to pay rent to my dad. Him and his son then moved into our house. At first Dave moved into the master bedroom with my mother while Matthew took over the guest bedroom. Everything seemed to settle into a new routine and Matthew and I would play a lot of video games together. I was happy to finally have a step-brother since I had been a single child for a very long time, but it wasn't long before Matthew began to complain about the bed in the guest room. His room had an old bed and understandably it affected his sleep. Dave promised him they would buy a new one soon. However, one afternoon I came home to find that the bed from my room had been moved into Matthew's room while the bed from the guest room had been placed in mine. I was taken aback and immediately asked my mother why this had happened. She casually dismissed it, saying that Matthew deserved a good bed to sleep in and that it wasn't a big deal. I was floored by her response and argued with her that Dave could have bought him a bed just as he promised. She shrugged and replied that I was older than Matthew, so I should learn to make sacrifices for the sake of her new family. After this incident, slowly it became painfully clear to me that my mother was clearly favoring Matthew over me, treating him with a level of care and attention that she seemed to withhold from me. For instance, during dinner he was allowed to take second plates without question, but if I reached for more she would smack my hand and harshly tell me not to be fat cow. The irony was that I wasn't even overweight. I was athletic, active and had a healthy appetite to match, but she insisted that Matthew, being a growing boy, deserved the extra food more than I did. Then there was the time when my dad told me he had tickets to a baseball game and wanted to take me. I was thrilled and couldn't wait to go, but when I told my mother, she immediately insisted that I should let Matthew go in my place, her reasoning because he's a boy and would enjoy it more. Obviously my dad refused to take Matthew and I went as decided. Obviously my dad refused to take Matthew to the baseball game in my place and I went as originally planned. The game was great and I was glad to spend that time with my dad. On multiple occasions my mother would plan day trips with just Dave and Matthew, deliberately excluding me from their plans. If Matthew ever invited me to join, she would insist that the only three of them needed to bond as a family and that I, being older, should sit this one out. It was as if she was creating a new family that didn't quite include me. The exclusion was hurtful, making me feel like an outsider in my own home, as though I was being slowly pushed to the margin of her new life with Dave and Matthew. When my 18th birthday was approaching this year, my dad informed my mother that he wanted to throw a big party for me to celebrate turning 18 and graduating high school. Since our family home was spacious enough and had a huge backyard, he planned to hire caterers and have everything set up here. My mother wouldn't have to lift a finger as he was taking care of all the arrangements. However, as expected, my mother tried to push back. She argued that holding such a big event for me was unnecessary and that we could just have a family dinner at a restaurant. My dad argued that since I was his only child, he wanted to celebrate such a huge milestone in my life with the rest of our family and friends. Even though I was okay with my dad's idea, my mother wasn't ready to let it go so easily. She then argued that throwing such a big celebration for me would be a slap in the face to Dave, as he could never afford to do something similar for Matthew when he would eventually graduate. She claimed it was unfair to make Matthew feel left out by hosting an event that was all about me. Then she went on to suggest that we could perhaps celebrate Matthew during the party as well. This was supposed to be my special day, a milestone, and yet my mother was more concerned about how it might affect Matthew and Dave. It was as though she couldn't stand the thought of me having a moment that was purely about me without somehow bringing Matthew into it. My dad, however, had had enough of her arguments. He firmly reminded her that Matthew was none of his concern and that this party was for me, his daughter, who deserved to be celebrated. He made it clear that he was going to throw this party whether she liked it or not, and that if her new family didn't like it, then they were all uninvited from my party, and that was the end of the discussion. This immediately made my Mother backtracked her statements and she grudgingly agreed to let me celebrate. Next, when it came to planning the party, my mother continued to interfere with everything. She started dictating how things should be done, saying that since Dave preferred vegan meals, we needed to have more vegan options at my party now. This was going to be a complete waste of money since I knew no one else was vegan. But I did not want to fight with her, so I agreed. Next, I love eating fish and wanted to order a fish item, but my mother informed me that Matthew didn't like fish, so I shouldn't order any fish dishes. I tried to stay calm and told her firmly that this was my party and I wanted to order food that I liked. If Dave and Matthew had an issue with anything I was going to be ordering, then they could adjust for one evening. My response set her off. She yelled at me, accusing me of disrespecting her family and calling me a spoiled brat. She went on to claim that my dad's money was getting to my head and that I needed to learn to care about her husband and her son as well. She shook her head, wagging a finger at my face, and told me I should teach you a lesson for acting so entitled. She then went on to insist that if I didn't consider what Dave and Matthew liked while planning this party, then she was going to ground me and take away my phone as my punishment. At that point I saw red. I realized I was going to be turning 18 and had nothing to lose anymore. I was going to be moving out soon anyway, so I decided to finally let out all the years of suppressed anger. I shouted back at her, telling her that I had always considered Matthew and Dave's needs, but this was my party, my last Tara before moving out, and I deserve the freedom to make my own choices. I told her that I had kept my mouth shut long enough, and if she took away my phone or grounded me for no reason, I would call CPS on her for mentally and emotionally torturing me all the time. Over the years it was clearly a bluff, but I wanted her to think twice before mistreating me ever again. Her eyes widened in shock when she heard me say this. She knew a CPS investigation might affect her relationship with Dave and Matthew, who was still a minor. Then I went on to tell her that if she no longer saw me as her daughter, then I would be cutting off all contact with her. When I went to college, I didn't want a mother anyway who never prioritized me, who always put others before me, and who made me feel like I was second best in my own home. It was a moment of raw, unfiltered honesty, and I made it clear that I was done with being pushed aside. This seemed to shake her up. She then started to insist that I was overreacting and that all she ever wanted was for me to treat Dave and Matthew just like I treated other family members. After this argument, she avoided giving her opinions to me as much about my party. On the day of the party, I was excited to celebrate with my family and friends. Dave had offered to play music for the event, and it was a blast. Matthew, some of my cousins, and I had a great time on the dance floor, enjoying the lively atmosphere. Meanwhile, Dad was busy chatting with some relatives, proudly bragging about the college I was about to attend. However, the only person who stood out as a sore thumb was my mother. She was off in the kitchen drinking her margarita and clearly avoiding mingling with the rest of us. Her disinterest and detachment were palpable, and it was hard not to notice how she was distancing herself from the celebration. Even Dave noticed how distant she was and went to talk to her, trying to convince her to enjoy the day like the rest of us. When it came time to cut the cake, my mother didn't come to stand next to me while everyone sang happy birthday to me. Dad and I didn't bother, and we simply went ahead and cut the cake, making the most of the moment despite her absence. It was a bittersweet reminder of how strained our relationship had become, even on a day that was meant to be about celebrating me. When the rest of the food started to be served out, I watched as my mother carefully prepared plates for Dave and Matthew. She seemed to take extra care, making sure they had everything they liked. I felt a pang of jealousy watching her serve them with such attention while ignoring me at my own party. I wanted to let the rest of the guests get their food first, so I hung back a little, waiting for my turn. Suddenly, out of nowhere, my mother came. "You